Hi, everybody.
If I can find the picture.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our second Marriage of Figaro Opera in Conversation. Thank you so much to Big Canvas Comedy here at the Blackstone Theater for hosting us tonight and partnering with us, and also having someone on this panel with us to talk about comedy. So this is great. You all have bio sheets available, so I'm not going to read everybody's bio all the way through, but I encourage you to because everybody is really great and interesting. I'm going to do brief introductions. So, as I pointed out, Doug is with Big Canvas Comedy and one of our hosts for the evening. Addie is an actor and director at Creighton University, and Nate Ruleaux is an artist. You may know him in Omaha as a visual artist, but also has a background in Commedia and classically trained theater. So we're excited to be there. If you are an Opera in Conversation regular, you might remember Nate from previous Opera in Conversations in a different space. So we're there. So a few housekeeping notes. If you need the restroom, it's right through that door. Please feel free to go at any point in time. Drinks, the bar is open and available. Please feel free to get beverages. If this is your first Opera in Conversation, it's called Opera in Conversation for a reason. So we will certainly be in a space for questions and all of that, and we'll ask you at this time. It's a little different than when we're at the Benson Theater because we are not live streaming tonight, we're recording. So this will go on our YouTube probably before the end of the week, but that means you don't have to wait for Pat to get to you with a microphone. We have kind of some boom mics set up all around for the recording, so you don't have to wait for Pat to come find you with the mic. You can just let us know you have a question, and we'll be right here. So without further ado, we'll get started. So everyone, I was saying normally I have a table in front of me and I stand and then I move and logistics. So when we were having our pre-conversation about this, I would love to start with each of you to say kind of briefly how you're coming to this conversation, or what were the first things that are kind of sparking for you when you think about comic tropes and those stories and characters that kind of stand the test of time, and what you're coming into this conversation with.
Ladies first.
There you go.
Hi, I'm Addie. My pronouns are she, her. I come to this work from a couple of different places. I identify as an intersectional artist, multidisciplinary. My training is as an actor, musical theater first. Then I moved into directing, and I'm also an educator. I have a love of comedy, both in contemporary settings and in classical works. I've done a lot of Shakespeare. I've done some Commedia. I've done some restoration comedy. So I've lived in the world of kind of verbal wit and also physical comedy. I appreciate highbrow and lowbrow. I love verse. And I also look at this work as an educator and as a director. So thinking about how comedy has a rhythm and it has certain things that really can't be taught, but there are elements that are repeatable and that are specific and that you can assign kind of beats to, but timing and intuition is something that is just kind of, you have it or you don't. And I feel really fortunate that I have it, but I've grown up in working in comedy and musical comedy, so that's kind of how I come to this work.
Yeah, I'm Nathaniel Nate Ruleaux, and like you were saying, I guess I introduce myself a lot as a storyteller, kind of in general. I like to play a lot of different mediums, and I have my master's degree in theater. I've worked a lot in theater and film in different comedic roles, and I also am a visual artist. And coming to this conversation, I guess, I want to bring a little bit of visual art kind of talk, and also I'm a partner and a father of a little kid, so a lot of my thoughts, especially when dealing with archetypes and Commedia tropes, is going back to animation, or my connection with Marriage of Figaro is Bugs Bunny, and that's my first interaction with it, I guess. And to just kind of talk a little bit about where you see these different characters come up and why they've withstood the test of time, and how we all relate to them, and kind of how they came about. But also, I guess I just got done. I did some paintings for the opera for next year's season coming up, And for Don Pasquale, when we were talking about these different flowers, I did these different kind of flower images for each show. Yeah, and I'm glad that that's one. So the purple one, there are these three different. For that one, we weren't sure what flower we were going to use. We were like, so I was just like, I'm going to Google funny flowers, and one of the first ones I found were these really cool orchids that kind of look like little people, and I was like, oh, I can see these Commedia characters that are in this show, that are in so many shows, and I can actually stage them in this kind of viewpoints, theatrical way that carries over from visual art of any styling, and kind of put like, okay, we have the Pantalone kind of like older gentleman character up top, kind of looking over the young lovers, and just like what kind of pieces of that can I put in this image that can tell a story or like prep you for the story you'll see on stage soon. So I want to talk a little bit about that kind of stuff, but also talk a little bit about my experience like working in comedy and how I've throughout my career have pulled, I guess, from those characters to tell a myriad of different stories.
And my name's Doug Rothgeb, he, him. I come into this as the guy that makes stuff up. The stand-up comedian, I also have done stage shows, plays, and theater and movies and things. And so the idea of looking at this show as being satire is very interesting to me, how satire was back then versus what it is now, and how satire, this idea that it's a mirror holding up to ourselves of showing us how ugly we can be or how ugly we are at times. And so the timing idea, the improv-wise, it's all about timing. It's all about being in the moment, present and real. And so this idea of how this marriage and this opera comes together and how it pokes fun at a lot of things, but yet how we have to rein it in nowadays with the rules and the politically correct world that we live in and how it fits. So,
awesome. Addie and Doug, you both teach comedy and teach that to other people. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what are kind of those set elements that you always are trying to teach or you're always trying to instill in students when they're learning how to do this?
Well, I can say from a scripted perspective, honoring the text, because the playwright is the person who knows the world intimately, and there's a specificity to comedy, particularly when it is prescripted in that way, and you know that there is a language and there is a rhythm and there's a reason they chose specific words. There's a reason that the language is telling you something. So being specific enough and intuitive enough and dedicated enough to memorize the text as it's written and not approximate. Because often when you approximate, you lose what makes the joke work. And I know we talked a little bit about this on our pre-chat, but particularly when you're looking at language like in Shakespeare, there's some rhymes and jokes that we may not get because our language has evolved in a certain way, and the words don't have the same meaning, but it's still really integral to the structure of the text and to the story to honor that. So starting with the text and then looking at like what type of comedy this is. And so knowing enough about the rules and the world in order to play those moments authentically. Typically, comedy is not funny if the actor is in on the joke and if they're going, watch how funny I'm about to be. So playing those moments with authenticity, truth, and then precise repeatability. So knowing that certain styles require you to have choreography and hit marks or live physically in a world, because walking around like a 21st century teenager doesn't quite work if you're supposed to be in a corset and doing fan choreography. So sort of knowing the rules in order to be able to live within the parameters of the world, that's usually where I start. But it's kind of also trying things on and seeing what works, because not everyone is exceptional in Shakespeare. Not everyone is suited for certain types of comedy. Contemporary comedy tends to be a little bit easier because we see representation of it and can imagine ourselves in it a little bit easier. So it's sometimes you start with what you know and then go backwards. that's kind of where
I think that's
go in
really
that world.
interesting because last week in our upper conversation with our director and conductor, they talked so much, if you were there last week, about how they have a plan and they have a very detailed plan and they're thinking all of the time about how all of those pieces work and fit. And you're talking about the exact same thing in that space of like, for it to look effortless, there's a plan and you have to know it.
Yeah.
You have to follow it. And then you work in improv.
And
where
I come in a
that's
world
totally
where there
different.
are no plans, yeah. So, but it is about character, timing, being present, vulnerable, authentic, all of those, you hit every single world. And for people to identify the character, you have to be real. And if you're not real, people won't gravitate to that character. And so we teach this idea of being real in the moment, because reality is funny if you really look at it. And then that old adage of tragedy plus time equals comedy. It's horrible to say, but it's real. You know, over time you start to realize, you look back on a tragedy in your life and yeah, there were funny things that led up to that tragedy. And so we teach this idea of the yes and for improv, of being in agreement with that person and making that person on stage with you look better than anybody in the world, that you make them look great. And I come from a world of also being the physical comedian. I'm the one that's broken my body so many times on stage just trying to get a laugh. Being real while you're throwing your body around is hard. And we've talked about that previously too, about it's easier to do a drama or something dramatic than it is to do comedy, because comedy is really difficult. Even Robin Williams said that. Comedy is hard, so.
And a lot of times the challenge in comedy that we don't necessarily see as many pitfalls in tragedy or in drama is the goal of a comedy is to make the audience laugh or enjoy with you. And there can be, especially with young folks or people who are a little bit greener, the impulse to go, this audience is responding differently than the last audience. I'm not doing enough. I'm not getting what I need. So there's a tendency to push or try or force. And as soon as you lose the ease and the authenticity and the trust of the material and preparation, you lose the audience. So it's a really delicate line to toe. I'm sure you've experienced that in your work as an actor too. We all have, I think.
Totally. I mean, that makes me think a lot about like working with like younger actors or looking back at like myself when I was a younger actor. Is I guess thinking about like there's this idea of like you can just kind of wing it, and there's a cool like melding. I didn't talk about this in our last convo, but like one of my last gigs that was like in like film-ish realm was I got this gig for the West Virginia Lottery to do like these series of commercials that were called the West Virginia Lotto Bros. It was me and another actor from DC, brought us out to West Virginia, and basically the premise was we went to a gas station, somebody's like, you should buy a lotto ticket, you could win. The other guy says, I got a better chance of being struck by lightning, and then we're at a golf course and we get struck by lightning, and then it's like, you could win. And but when we showed up for the job, we had done auditions with like vague scripts, and we showed up for the job, and they set up everything, and you know, we both were like theater folks from DC who were like, oh, we're doing film things, like what are we doing? You know, we're doing makeup and we get the camera set and we get to our marks. It's like, all right, this is everything I learned in like school about like film work. And they're like, action, and we're like,
What?
and eventually somebody's like, go, and we're like, we've never got a script, we don't know. So we were in this sudden position where they're like, oh, we had these vague kind of like bits planned out or like themes, but like we never put together dialogue for you guys or really what you're gonna do. And so we had to improv these takes, but at the same time I found like if we were just winging it, I just like the pressure of all that would add up and it'd go right into the camera. And eventually it was like, oh, I can take things that I've learned in theater, these like mathematical or like proven things like playing with my pitch or like going kind of opposites. If I scream like, ah, it's like a big dude, they like think it's funny. So like we kind of started pulling these characters or these pieces of Commedia like tropes and characters and ideas that were kind of like planned mixed with the improv. And that's something we kind of talked about the other day too, is that like my experience with improv has always been through edited improv, where it's like a podcast that I really like that's been kind of curated, or Whose Line I brought up too, right? Where it's like, oh man, they're like killing it with every single time. It's like, that's because they did like a million of these takes and I'm seeing the best one. And so I don't know, that it's an interesting like, comedy for me, especially in like classics work, or and almost all my work deals with like like stage combat levels of precision. And that's just kind of where I come from. I would come from like a pretty stage combat heavy program. So this idea of like move, dance with your partner, and if you throw it off, you could risk someone's safety. And the same thing, if you throw off the joke, you're throwing off the bit, you're throwing off the moment. And I think I mentioned a little bit last time, like I was like, so unlike different moments as an actor where you're trying to be so invested in the moment where you can kind of lose yourself a little bit, like you don't want that in comedy because you have to do this match, which is true, but then I wanted to backpedal because I found like the places where I was able to find real connection in a lot of this comedy work is like in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, we have this scene where we're kind of playing tennis with words and going back and forth, and we've actually blocked it out into a tennis game, and it became a game. So if you can play games, and I feel like there's games in improv, right?
Yep.
But playing those games is what makes you grounded and real, even in work that has precision or boundaries or kind of builds to it.
And we teach that in improv. If you find the game within a scene, beat the heck out of it. Just continue to go to it because people want to see it. But then there's this rule that they call the rule of threes. If you do it 4 times, it's not funny. If you do 2 times, it's not enough. So you got to hit it 3 times, and then you've got it. So then you get the big laugh at the 3rd time.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about some of these, you've mentioned these kind of stock characters that you draw from. And let's talk a little bit about like who are these stock characters and like why do they keep showing up? Why do we keep using them hundreds of years later?
They're identifiable. I think that's a thing that we start to see the trend that, oh, I recognize this person, or I know this person. This is a person that's real to me. Like if we go back to Seinfeld, we all had a neighbor like Kramer. We've all had friends like Jerry or George. And so we identify with those people because we know them. So.
Yeah. Familiarity and formula are things that really work in television. We see that like sitcom or like certain episodics, the ones that are the crime, the drama, the courthouse, the whatever, the Grey's Anatomy is that there's a formula, and that's kind of soothing and can be really supportive for an audience, but then what subverts expectation is what's in that content. And I think that even though they're archetypes or they're character tropes, it's kind of the same thing as stereotype. We don't want to generalize, but if you synthesize down, there's a core of something that still remains true, even in our current society. If you're thinking about like a general or a miser or a doctor or, like the ingenue or young lovers or the wizened person in a servitude position. These are characters that we see that may have different careers now than what they were assigned to in our history, but we can relate to them.
Yeah.
Exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess like, I mentioned like, I don't know how many folks like know Futurama or like The Simpsons, but like those characters are really there. And I think like Zap Brannigan is this like Captain Kirk, like archetype thing, but like with these classic Commedia traits that really like last to this day. And it really helps, I guess, with like our current world of like TikTok and kind of short attention spans and a visual screen world. It really helps to kind of have this kind of I guess like why this is able to last through these kind of shifts in our technology and how we take in art, to me is always like they were kind of built to be something that went past language barriers. There were a lot of traveling. There'd be a pandemic. There'd be some sort of emergency where you'd have to go out and tour your company. You couldn't be in town anymore. And so you were able to take these raw human characteristics that everybody as a human being experiences or knows somebody or can relate somehow or attach their own experiences to. And you could kind of place that in whatever, oh, we're in this town, like you go talk to somebody like, hey, who's the mayor? Like, what's the mayor like? Okay, we're gonna just attach that to the Pantalone character and we're gonna see how we can kind of do these modern references at this time. And that went from like The Village to like right now where it's like, okay, like who can we pull from in our current like zeitgeist who we can like place in these and that's how we can modernize and update and keep things fresh and true and current with like our modern sensibilities.
and it always comes back around, like almost always. You may not be familiar, there's a play called Mr. Burns, a post-electric play. It's a 3-act piece that has different forms in each act. The first act is sort of based in realism, and it's set outside around a campfire, and this group of people are existing in the world post-apocalypse, where nuclear power plants have exploded, and now they have no way to have entertainment and are retelling episodes of The Simpsons around a campfire. In Act 2, 7 years in the future, they're a touring acting troupe reenacting episodes of The Simpsons because there's no real entertainment. Act 3 is 75 years after that, and these people's stories have merged with The Simpsons, and they are telling the stories in musical theater, in mask, a la Greeks. And it's like, this has all come through, even without assuming that they're telling theater history, they've come back around. And I just think that's such a brilliant kind of reflection of how stories and our art form continues to be cyclical, even though it is evolving in so many ways.
Well, and so much, we're in a world that so much wants to push away the stereotypes, but yet the most famous things that we see on television in our shows and things are the stereotypes, because they exist, because people, the stereotypical people exist to this day. So.
Let's talk a little bit about those kind of stereotypical people in those stories, because you talked about it a little bit, of this idea of comedy and satire and comedy as a reflection of what's happening. And that's absolutely true with Marriage of Figaro. It's, based on a play that was written to be, political commentary and satire on class structure and what's happening. So, let's talk a little bit about how do we use comedy in that way, of that reflection of what's happening right now, and why does it work, or when it doesn't work, why does it really not work? I'm asking the really easy questions. Just softballs over here.
I guess I would say if it doesn't work because the stereotype is hurtful and hateful, but it will work if it's playful and realistic. All too often shows or things that we see where they play stereotypical, but it's hurtful and hateful, that doesn't fly. But and you had mentioned that they had changed one of the characters who had the stuttering thing, and now we've changed it to sneezing. And so, how do we deal with that? How do people with the stutter deal with that? I know, or how do people with allergies deal with it? We've got so many things that we could go, okay, we can't do this because of this, but we can do this because of this. It's interesting, but I think as long as you play it in a loving, caring manner and pay tribute to those people. I did a show, The Boys Next Door, where I played a handy-capable young man, and I followed a young man around, and I learned everything I could about him and his movements and things like that. And I wanted to pay tribute to him more than people said we were doing things. Whenever that show comes up, people say, "Oh, you're being mean to them," and it's like, no, we're paying tribute to them because we honor them and respect them. That's why we're doing this show, and it was one of the most educational shows I've ever done. It taught me so much more about people that have to deal with deficiencies. I don't know if that's the correct way to say it, but they're so great in some areas, but yet they have these issues here, and so you have to lift them, those great parts of them up, and that's what I tried to do. Was Norman, who I played, Norman Polanski, he was such a loving, caring person that it got lost because you had to play this handicap. And I had so much fun playing up this love and this care and this concern for others. And so that's the stereotype that you see, but yet every person that I've met that has Down syndrome, the most loving, caring people I've ever been around. And they don't care who you are or what you are. They love you just because you're there and you're talking to them. So.
And I love that space of, if you're doing it in a thoughtful way, that is not intended to have that mean spirit and cause harm if it's in that way. And we can all still get it wrong, and then we acknowledge when we get it wrong.
Right?
Yep.
That's Right. And this is such a challenge to navigate because we all want to be, I hope, I assume good intent when we're working in material, but thinking about intentional casting and representing people who have historically been marginalized and providing opportunities for them to play these roles that are written about them. So my philosophy as an educator is nothing about us without us. So I'm not going to produce or tell a story that I have no right to tell, unless my students are saying, we are not being represented, we need you to help us do this. But, there are certain stories that I wouldn't feel comfortable telling because it's not my journey to tell. Satire is something that can be really challenging in that way, but thinking about, there's some that are brilliant and there are some that fall short. And if there's a way to do this where you're looking at it and going, what's the goal of this? Why are we telling this story? Who are we serving? What's our end result? And I find that the most compelling theater is the theater that leaves the audience going like, I have a call to action. There's something that I'm expected to do with this, whether it's enjoy it or be moved to go out and make change, rather than just feeling hopeless. And sometimes satire can make us feel hopeless, but if we're looking at both sides and maybe finding a common ground or an opportunity for conversation, that's when it can be really effective. I don't know if I have an answer or if that even got close to what.
No, I think you got it, but I like that, when we talk about it has a call to action, one of your calls to action was joy.
Yeah.
And feeling joy, and that is absolutely part of the goal. We could be in this space of, you're going to be in for a 3-hour opera, but you're going to have a really great time.
Yeah.
That can absolutely be part of the goal.
Totally. I guess a quick short thing, and then I'll try to talk about some heavier stuff. The first thing I guess I would always go to the source. I feel the going back to the text is important, especially when we kind of talked about this the other day. We were talking. I was Taming the Shrew has always been a big example for me. It's that show, if done badly, in my opinion, can come off it's super misogynistic, and it's in there. It's of the time, but you can produce that show where Petruchio and Kate are of equals and of equal spirits and of equal production.
They're in on it together.
Yes, and then that makes a different show. The show that is a comedy and can be laughed at and can be enjoyed and can be a rom-com from the past or whatever, So I think that's a big important thing, is just going back to the text. There's a reason why these classics exist, and so it's very easy to make adjustments. I guess so my quick, try to be quick hot take on I got another anecdote I could do later, but my hot take on you can't say stuff anymore. How do we this, we have to be politically correct in this stuff, is you can't say anything. Anybody can say anything. It's you're going to be held accountable if you say mean shit. It's going to happen. Yeah. And our world is burning, and everybody here wants peace and prosperity. And when somebody literally has the stage in a position of power where they can use it in a way that is harmful to another person, that should get called out. And with Cal Penn, I saw this on Instagram today, was here in town.
Yeah, I just saw him today.
And he had this great interview where somebody asked him the interviewer was you could never make Harold and Kumar 3 or 4. I don't know how many Harold and Kumar movies there are. But he's yeah, we could. We would just update it. We would just have modern sensibilities. That's how it would be, the same jokes, the same humor. We would just adjust. And it shouldn't be hard for a comedian or for writers or artists, for if somebody says hey, you maybe do too many fat jokes, you should try something else. You should learn another joke. If you're a comedian, you should be able to adjust, And I the real danger that I see is it can be found in our current legislature and different things that are being put around the country, where one of my funniest earliest roles was Francis Flute in Midsummer Night's Dream, right? I did it in Lincoln, and that was one of my earliest roles. And he's a rude mechanical. He's a fair youth who ends up playing Thisbe in this tragedy that the players put on, if you're not familiar with Midsummer. But Shakespeare is required reading in our educational system, and I performed it for kids who love the part, will always remember that part. It's very Bugs Bunny and drag kind of a thing. And I hope that they continue to appreciate the classics from that performance, the silly performance I did with the mop and ridiculousness. But the language in a lot of bills going on right now would make performing Midsummer illegal. Mm-hmm. There's language that allows for drag to be banned from our classics. So that's so dangerous to me. And along with so many classics and modern works, these shows are meant to share like humanity and create empathy and joy was like a big thing, you know, and like. I guess like I took some notes on this because it's a tough issue for me. And I just want to know, like, but like that is why like you know, what's at risk in comedy isn't the like this like you can't say anything anymore. It's like powers of racism and white supremacy are working to like eradicate, you know, these.
Representation.
Yes, yeah, and there are these efforts to like distort history that makes the mirror to hold up to nature. They're spraying whipped cream on it, so you can't see the mirror anymore, you know? And so like, with this kind of specific one, I was like thinking about it a lot since our last conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, that'll take away opportunities from comedy, to come from truth, and it'll strip like the ability of marginalized groups. Like you were saying, like people to tell their own stories. Like, anecdote and the anecdote, I'm Oglala Lakota, I've been in a show where I played the like settler preacher guy, and my best friend, who was 5'0" redhead, played the old Indian chief. And they did redskin makeup. And at this show, everyone who was there believed we were telling this story of Tecumseh, and it was this big thing telling the story of natives, and they all like had good intention behind it. But I was like, I could never take my grandfather to this. He grew up on the res. Like, what would this experience be for him? Or we all took pictures at the end, and I was a U.S. soldier. Like, I like history, I like combat, so I was like, I got to fight a lot in this role, but I'd be in my U.S. uniform, and there would be white friends of mine there who are posing being scalped with the people on their way out. And you know, it's like, if there were Native people in those roles, it would be different. And so to really tell things truthfully and to have comedy that has to have truth, or it's that dead like wugga wugga, you kind of need that there. I don't know. Super heavy, get into heavy stuff, but it was one of those questions where it's like, if I don't say it, I'll regret it for the rest of the night, you know?
And I think it's we can't have a conversation about comedy without talking about it, because you know comedy is hard, and it also has a lot of power, and so we have to acknowledge when it works and doesn't work, and how it could go wrong. So thank you for bringing that.
That's all
tonight.
right. I thought about it in the shower.
That's where all the best ideas come from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Each of you talked a little bit though about how you feel the Marriage of Figaro works into what you've been saying tonight. And let's start with you.
Oh, with me?
Okay.
Yeah, you're
I've
the
been
easy-
talking a lot.
I have hearing aids.
Okay.
And you're the easiest for me to
Oh.
understand.
All right, so, how do I, now you gave me a minute to think about it. I've watched just a little bit of the Marriage of Figaro, and we talked about the timing, because there's the scenes that I've seen, and the things that I've seen is regarding the stutterer, the sneeze, the sneeze. You have to do those precisely. From what I've seen, the things that they have people coming across and doing things and telling this story of this, it seems almost like he's stumbling around a lot. You have to tell those precisely, and that person has to be precise in their movement, or you lose the joke, you lose the moment, and the timing has to be right. I guess if you've ever seen any show, everything is precise. The movements have to be precise. The movement is with a purpose. The movement means something. And this I feel is that if you don't move with a purpose, and your movements and the way you act is not with a purpose, you lose the funny. You lose the comedy within that. And this one seems more to me, and that's just coming from not an opera kind of person, but if you're not committing to that movement, then you lose the comedy within the show.
And did you see that in the little bits that you watched?
Yes. Oh, yeah. There was one part where he kept coming up, and then somebody would come in. He would dance up, and then somebody would come in, and he'd dance back and hide from them. So there were moments where he was like, "Nope, got to hide from this person," and he had to show that in his physicality. If he didn't show that, I would have never understood what he was doing. I was like, okay, he's bounding to the front. Now he's bounding to back. But he showed it through his face, through his movement and thing that, oh, here comes somebody I gotta hide from. And here comes two lovely girls. I'm going to follow them. You could see that, okay, I see what he's playing here. Without the music, without everything, it would have been lost. But the way he moved, the way he presented himself, the way he carried himself, sold the entire jokes for me.
I imagine you're going to talk a little bit about language and how Commedia
How to
can
get past the
transcend-
language difference.
Yeah, right. I'll leave that for you.
Perfect.
What I see the most, and I am not super familiar with Marriage of Figaro, but what I see is these two characters who are in servant roles, who are besting the master, which really lives in the world of Commedia. So the trope characters are Arlecchino and Columbina, who are the sort of like in on being really subvertive, smart, but still in these positions where they don't have any power. So the way that they can exude power is by being more manipulative or smarter than the people in charge and being able to get what they want through that. And Columbina is often like sexy, physical, sort of like that body, like objectifying woman. And Arlecchino is kind of like the sly, goofy, good at like being in, usually pretty well respected and liked by the people in charge, but still not quite doing his job. And I think seeing those relationships and how they are able to shift the status on its head by becoming besting the people in charge or the people in power. You'll see that in this production.
That's how I feel too. And I don't want to like ruin, this is why I was like, I don't want to like put my theater brain in your head. But like what I would do at a show, or like when I saw Romeo and Juliet, like it is not exactly Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. It has a lot of differences. So like I would sit there and be like, okay, where are the lovers? Where is the like old miserly father? Where are these clowns? Where's the doctor? There are these setups that are there that I think really help, especially with somebody who I'd seen one opera before that ever in person. You know, I'd listened to a lot. My dad would play opera in his English classroom a lot, like when people were taking tests. It's like that was my experience with it, really. But seeing these shows, like to get, you guys have a wonderful, and you might want to share a little bit about all the difficulty, like writing out the translation. But I almost think that's not necessarily necessary in a good comedy production that I'm sure you guys have, which is like from the performances, you should be able to kind of tell the character types and what they're after. And even if you get it wrong, you don't have to be a dramaturg to like get this stuff. I would ask myself like, okay, who's Bugs Bunny? You know, who's being that clown? Who are the lovers finding those parts? And then if it seems like, oh, maybe I was wrong about that, you can tell a lot like, okay, so maybe this guy is actually more of a Capitano, like he's the big, brash, kind of Gaston kind of character, if you're into Beauty and the Beast, right? Maybe he was that, but for a second I thought he was the miser because he was into money, or there are these characteristics that like, to make more layers, so it's not like, I'm just watching a Looney Tune. To make more layers, these roles should kind of draw from the characteristics of each other for whatever the bit is. So I think a lot of it is like, kind of recognizing those. You don't have to do it in the moment if you're enjoying the show, but afterwards it's kind of fun to be like, oh man, can I understand a little bit more about the show or what was happening by kind of walking through and being like, okay, so that was a 3-hour-long show, and what were the characters throughout it, where did they go, and how did they interact with each other? Power dynamics are huge too, kind of like you were saying, like with this like master-servant space, these I guess like where people are staged is always really interesting to me, where you know, what position is a position of power, where on stage, close down usually, where is a position of servitude or less power. That all together are the elements that tell the story in a visual enough way to kind of transcend some of that language barrier, at least for me. But also sometimes I'm like, can I just like shut my brain up and enjoy the show too? Like, so it's kind of, you know, that's something to think about maybe a little bit beforehand and a little bit during, and then like at coffee or drinks after. Like that's a good space for some of that.
You can all come to Opera in Conversation on April 4th, and then we'll ask you about all of this. And I'd like you to share it.
We'll all process together.
Right. But I think, you know, talking about that in the language, one of the things that we talked about too was, you talked about earlier about how specific the language and the jokes are. And in opera, we have that with music because there's built-in rhythm with the music. Then you're marrying the rhythm with the words. And then we're also trying to match that rhythm with the super titles that are being created and projected above the screen so that you can see all the words. And so your jokes have to land in all of these different places. And so when you talk about it being really hard and that timing, it's like, there's so much timing. So that's a lot of happening too, and also like updating that language for those super titles so that it matches what we're talking about now in 2023.
Right.
How are those jokes gonna hit but also match what was originally intended? So we've started off our audience question section. Thank you for that. I want to open it up to other questions from our
I
audience.
have one more question. The poster up there,
Yep.
are those an example of the costumes that are in this play?
These are not exactly the costumes, but it will be classically costumed, if that makes sense. So these are not the specific ones from this show, but they are of that time period.
But you can already see some of the relationships that you just talked about,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You see this kind of like,
He's
there's,
in on the joke, he
Yeah.
knows,
there's a lot of sex in a lot of this too. That's like the driving factors of your brain, your wallet, or like sex in a lot of this too. So like you can kind of, I don't know, see the power dynamics even from how they're staged in this photo of like, Columbine is usually even ahead of the game of any of the other clowns, right? So she's in his ear.
You know, I
like,
couldn't see that until after we've had this talk tonight, but I
Cool.
see all that.
awesome,
Yeah.
great.
Great.
So hopefully
It's
see that in the
working.
show. Yeah.
Well, and I'm sure that when he's the servant, he's probably got that face is different, or that stance is different, or his movement is different. So, yeah, when he's the servant, but when he's planning and conniving and stuff, that's the face. Like, I'm gonna get everybody. Yeah, I love that. That is, it's a wonderful picture.
Any other audience questions? I have plenty more, don't worry.
Something I'm thinking about is, like, we talk a lot about, representation and making text responsive to the times and updating things like that. Something I'm thinking about is at what point are the tropes themselves and buying into them problematic to the current time or something like that? And I'm thinking just, straight away, like along, lines of gender.
Yeah,
How gendered the tropes are.
yeah.
And how damaging the tropes themselves as beloved and as formulaic and easily solvable as they are. When does our employment of them in production or whatever, not challenging them, when does that become,
Good question.
are we a part of the problem? I don't know why I'm including myself in this.
If you're
No.
in the room, I think that's a valid question. And I don't know that I can answer that in the world of opera because there's different rules. But for a lot of these classic texts, depending on when they were written, who owns the rights, if at all, what the most current updated version, like Shakespeare, there are no rules with Shakespeare because he's been dead for so many years. So we see a lot of, pardon my language, gender in retelling stories using Shakespeare's words or Shakespeare's stories and elevating them or updating them to be more in line with what we see today, particularly thinking about youth who are non-binary because there are very few roles that are written for people who identify between. So looking at a pants role or like a Rosalind or a Portia or
Carabino.
right, so these characters that you can look at differently actually could give really great opportunity to people who feel othered and haven't been represented. But I think that's part of the question that we as artists and makers have to continue to ask ourselves is, what is this serving and why are we doing it? Is there a better show to be doing, or are we being part of the problem and not actually being solution makers?
I'll go back to Cal Penn. I was lucky enough to see Cal Penn today, and he talked about a character that he did in Van Wilder called Taj Mahal. Yes, an Indian character named Taj Mahal. He was going to refuse to do it until he was able to see that there was growth of that character. And that's where he was speaking to this idea that if we don't see growth in a character, if we don't see an arc, then that character does not need to exist anymore. It's along the lines, and I come from a biblical world now, and this idea of these clobber texts that you read in the Bible and things, there's a point where you need to just eliminate them because not all gospel is gospel. Not all theater should be theater, And yes, people will say, hey, you're censoring things, but there's a point where it becomes hurtful rather than growth. So that's where I come from, I guess.
Totally. I guess like I had two thoughts that kind of came up from your question. Is like there's certain parts of like coming from like a history side of things. It can cause problems to not acknowledge things that
The problem.
Merchant has Merchant has like a lot of anti-Semitism in it. Like that's there. You can work that show and build it into something that like you can tell that in a way that can fight that part of history. But if you also ignore that part of history, you're wiping away and ignoring that people were anti-Semitic in that time. So it's like really tough. Like that's more for things that already exist. Or a lot of like, hey, we're gonna cut this blackface scene out of this film, and so now it looks really lovely and Christmassy. And it's like, whoa, there was blackface in that film? I had no idea. You know, like that kind of stuff to me is a problem. But I think like in like I was kind of saying before, I think in a lot of these classics, and especially in like the tropes or stereotypes, if you want to say, of these Commedia characters or these positions of power, is that they're human enough that they can kind of transcend that thing to where you can see that it's bad, or you can attach it in a way that like can push back against some things. That's so hard to like explain, I guess. But something I thought about that I talked about, like Romeo and Juliet had two women, Romeo and Juliet, and it told that story in such an amazing way. And that reminded me of like, I talked about this at the last talk too, but like my favorite production I was ever in, not really, but like one of my favorite productions ever was I was in Othello, where Othello was played by a woman, and I was Iago. And so I had this amazing wealth of places to come from where Iago wasn't just, his hate for Othello wasn't just racism or being angry that he got passed over for his job, but he also has the insecurities and homophobia of like, this woman slept with my wife, versus like just being like cuckolded in the first place. It adds more to experiment and play with like, okay, like, but even that's what they were doing in Shakespeare's day too. Like all these things were very like malleable and playing, and they'd adjust with time, you know? So I think that things have to be reworked or rethought, but it's all about presentation and the worst thing, I guess like I think most big goof ups and really like harm that might be unintentional harm that occurs is from not knowing your stuff, not doing your homework. And like if you, just like you were saying with like, especially with like classics and Shakespeare, if you don't go through and know the time period, know the situation in which it was written, know the background of what was going on then, and then bringing that to now, and then knowing the roots of all these words that have changed because language changes. If you have all that knowledge, you can tell a beautiful story without having to change like anything. But if you don't do that work, you're gonna say something or pronounce something or do something that's probably gonna cause some harm or break the world. Even as a performer, you shouldn't want to shatter someone's reality of the show. You want them to live in it. And so if you're causing harm, or if you're flying without having your pilot's license, you're gonna freak out your audience and you're gonna lose them.
Yeah, the history and the context behind the story is, I think if you go in knowing the history and the context, it helps a lot. It helps to know that this is what was going on at the time to explain the story. For you to go, okay, that's why they did it. I was having a conversation, my son, he's got a speech impediment, and I told him that they had taken out the stutterer and made it a sneezer, and he was like, that's dumb, you know? And I'm like, why? And he goes, because I would have identified with the speech impediment because of the simple fact, someone's on stage that has my disability. Somebody is doing what I can't, is doing what I do. And so he said, I would have probably appreciated it more rather than this sneezer. And so,
Interesting insight.
Yeah.
Son.
Yeah, and he's a stand-up comedian now, even with the impediment, so, and he's done theater and stuff, and so it gives him, when he sees other people with impediments, it gives him motivation to go, I can do that too. So maybe we've gotten to a point where we're pushing like you said, when is too far, when is too much, and when is, okay, we've crossed a line, how do we go back? Can we go back? That's a very good question too, so.
I would always just like add on that too. Like I'd always say that like if the actor if the person who experienced it or is that ethnicity or has that disability or neurodivergence or gender identity or any of those things, if you have good casting, you're going to tell a better story than if you don't. Every single time, no matter what. There will always be, just to know the history is great, but I can study as much as I want about like somebody who's completely different than me. Race, gender identity, anything, right? How they move around through the world, what they're like, and I can do all the character physical work I want and read all the books and watch a bunch of docs and follow them around for a month, but I'm never going to tell the story as truthfully as they could, ever. And that's something that I feel like during my career, I've had to like come to terms with, because there's a lot of awesome roles out there that I like to play, but I also know that the ones that are closer to me, I'm going to tell which doesn't mean that they all have to be little Nate Ruleaux, but the ones that I have more of a depth of history, sensorial memory, like connecting to, the better I will portray that character and the better I'll tell that story.
That connects for me with something when we talked about in the pre-talk about from improv of this space of riding the line of reality, of being close enough to reality that it feels connected and comfortable and I know what's happening, while also being just on the other side of it so that it's still comedy and it's still entertainment and it's still in that space. Because if it's really reality, like maybe that's not funny.
Right. And I think that, and with anything like that, like, you're never gonna know where the line is until you push it, too, you know? I think it's just all about exploring and coming with things in this joyful, good, hearted, performative way.
Rehearsal is so important for this kind of storytelling.
Totally.
You get to play and try and process makes good product.
And that's why comedy movies look so easy too. Like we were talking about, they have the million takes. We got to do a million. We did so many bad West Virginia lottery commercials that we were able to get some funny ones to where they had us back. You know, like it just takes it takes exploration, which unfortunately, especially in the arts and our very like underfunded, like not super supported art world before pre and post pandemic, like there's not a lot of time for that. So people have to bust. They have to work hard.
Yeah. They're using every second of this rehearsal process to go through that plan and figure out all of those movements and all of those things. We have time for one more question. I see movement happening.
Yeah, there's movement over here.
No. I don't want to start lecturing. It's supposed to be a question.
Yes, a question does typically end with a question, but that's okay. We'll
I
hang
can
around.
sort of create a question mark at the
Right,
end.
exactly. We'll hang around for a minute afterwards and you can have that conversation as part of it. I want to ask our panelists, is there anything else that like you were dying to talk about tonight and say that we didn't get to? This could have been like a 3-hour conversation, I just will have you know.
I can't remember, I grabbed the wrong notebook.
I appreciated this coming from the world of making up. Yes, I've done stage shows and things like this, but to go from this idea of just jumping out of a plane without a parachute, what I always do week after week, and making up stuff based on what the audience throws at us. And we always jokingly say, if the show sucks, it's your fault because you gave us the suggestion. And then going to this and seeing and witnessing the movement, the structure, ours is loosey-goosey compared to perfect, there's two different worlds, but yet they're telling the similar stories. We can go from a musical to that and to still tell the same similar story that it's the smells and bells that we're used to. It takes us back to a place where we're like, oh yeah, takes us to a comfort point. And that's what I appreciate is you can watch different levels of art, different ways of doing the art. People always say that improv isn't theater, but yet to me it's the purest form of theater. Because it forces you to be a character, it forces you to have to create an environment, it forces you to show people without telling people, and you have to find a relationship. And that's what they're doing, but they're doing it in a different way than I'm doing it. So
I don't have anything profound to add.
That's okay, I just wanted to make space. And if there was a thing that you were dying to get out there, we didn't
I don't-
come up organically.
I just try to think, I guess like I just hope, you know, we were talking about, when we first brought up you doing this and then I could come back, I was like, oh, you know, like, I don't know, I wasn't sure what to talk about, especially because I was like, okay, Commedia, I could lecture, I got my master's to lecture about it, but I don't really want to do that, and then we kind of have this kind of big comedy kind of like, it's so tough to be like, talk about comedy, the entire history of like human beings smiling about things, and that's really difficult, but I hope that like, the thing that I think is kind of fun is watching shows, especially ones that I might not normally be an audience member for, and seeing like, why was that funny to me? As a performer, it's all about like kind of, oh, I want to steal that. I'm locking that up, like that's why. But sometimes it's nice just to you learn a little bit about yourself by being like, oh, like how does this connect with this thing? Why is Marriage of Figaro making me think about a Mel Brooks movie all of a sudden? You know, that kind of stuff. Like, where are those connections for you, and what does that kind of tell you about what you like and how you experience the world?
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that you all see the opera next week and think about what you like, and then come back to Opera in Conversation April 4th. We'll be back at the Benson Theater. And tell us what you liked, or tell us, you know, what you learned about yourself from seeing the show, or if you saw these stock characters, or, you know, figured out a connection to The Simpsons. Come tell us about it. We want to hear about it. I want to thank our wonderful panelists this evening for this conversation. Thanks all of you for being here. I hope I'll see you at the opera, and I hope I'll see you on April 4th at the Benson Theater.
Right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.